I want to make a distinction that'll turn out to, again, be consequential in this course between what I'm going to call the early Enlightenment and the mature Enlightenment. And the particular has to do with the view of science that was embraced. Because the early Enlightenment thinkers, while they were committed to scientific principles, had a very different conception of knowledge than we intuitively all have as creatures of the mature Enlightenment. And so we're going to have to spend a little bit of time getting that straight. The most important idea of the early Enlightenment, which you already mentioned in relation to Bacon, was a preoccupation with certainty. They thought that knowledge can't be scientific unless it's indubitable, unless it's beyond question, beyond doubt. We only can think of something as scientifically established if it's certain. And so when we think of the early Enlightenment, and the early Enlightenment commitment to science, the scientific method is all about arriving at certainty. One of the most famous philosophical propositions of a French 17th century thinker by the name of Descartes is the so-called cogito. Cogito ergo sum is the Latin translation of the famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. The longer version of this is that Descartes was looking for propositions he could doubt because he wanted to throw them out and only retain the things that couldn't be thrown out. And in his Principles of Philosophy, he says, in rejecting everything which we can in any way doubt, it is easy for us to suppose that there is no God and no heaven, that there are no bodies, and that even that we ourselves have no hands or feet, or indeed any body at all. But we cannot, for all that suppose that we are, who, having such thoughts, are nothing. For it is a contradiction to suppose that what thinks does not, at the very time of its thinking, exist. Accordingly, this piece of knowledge, I think, therefore I am, is the first and most certain of all to occur to anyone who philosophizes in an orderly way. So that's the so-called cogito argument. Descartes says, I'm going to find something it's impossible to doubt, and that's then going to be my standard for what counts as true knowledge. So this search for certainty was the hallmark of genuine knowledge. So let's turn up the headlights on this idea in the following way. I'm going to put three assertions up on the slide here, and I want to talk about each of them for a minute. One assertion is that ocean tides are affected by the gravitational forces of the moon. A second assertion is that consent supplies the basis for political legitimacy. And a third assertion is that the sum of the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. If I were to say to you, which of these propositions can be known with the most certainty, which would you say?
Let me see. I would say that the most certain is the sum of the interior angles of the triangle. This would be the most certain.
Okay, would you agree with that?
Without a doubt.
Okay, which is the least certain?
The consent. That is the basis of
Consent
political.
is the least certain, so that, you agree with that?
Yes.
So, where would the ocean tides come in the middle? Okay. Why do the ocean tides come before consent as the basis of political legitimacy? Do you have a sense of that?
It's not, I mean, that's the way things are, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. I think gravitational forces can change for whatever reason.
Okay, so that may be why they're less certain than the triangles, but why are they more certain than the claim that consent is the basis of political legitimacy?
Because not every political order has consent.
Okay, all right. So the way you guys ordered them is exactly the way almost anybody in the modern world would order them. And that we'll see later when we have done more work, establishes that you are children of the mature Enlightenment. Now, if I were to say to you, just to underscore this a little bit more, what's at stake here, why is it that the sum of the interior angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees goes to the top of the list?
Because we can measure it, we can demonstrate that over and over and over again.
Okay, so let's take that and run with it. Imagine you find a triangle and you get out your protractor and you measure the three angles and you add them up and it comes to 180 degrees. And then you find a differently shaped triangle, you do that one and it comes to and you see it comes. And then you know, 11, 12, 15, 130 triangles. Are you still going to keep going and say, maybe the 131st triangle is going to be different? I better check or not?
Well, I might say I'm going to check, but there is still this mathematical truth to it.
It's a mathematical proof. Okay, so what does that mean?
It means that we've created a system to figure it out, so that
So
we don't have to
you
keep
don't
guessing.
have to look at the 131st triangle. You know that, right?
Yes.
You know with certainty, right? So that's why you say it's the most certain. So that's what we would think of as, a mathematician would say, there must be a theorem. Maybe I can't prove it, right, sitting right here now, but there's got to be a theorem that tells you why the sum of the interior angles add up to 180 and not to 163, right? And once you know there's a theorem, you're not going to keep going and measuring the next triangle. There's no point, right? And so another way of putting it is that it follows analytically, it follows definitionally. Likewise, if we said a bachelor is an unmarried man, we wouldn't have to say, well, this person is a bachelor and he's unmarried. This one is, what about the 15th bachelor? Well, the 16th bachelor, well, will we find one? No, you're not, right? It's nonsense. It follows definitionally. Whereas when we look at the ocean tides, the current theory is that the moon affects them, and probably right, but it might not be. There's certainly no theorem, right? And when we talk about consent as being the basis for political legitimacy, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. People disagree about such things, and some regimes are based on consent. Some that are not seem to endure for a very long time. So, okay, so, you know, what you said is very commonsensical and comports with, you know, if we had gone through 300 students, probably they all would have ordered these propositions in the ways that you did. Now, you've got to make a big imaginative leap, because the theorists of the early Enlightenment thought about them differently. And you may find this hard to believe going in, but you will find it easy to understand coming out. So let's go through it like this. The theorists of the early Enlightenment would have put, again, the mathematical proposition at the top. They would have put the proposition that consent is the basis of political legitimacy co-equal with that, which you might find shocking. And then the empirical proposition about the tides would have come in last. And understanding why they thought that way might seem like an arcane project, but actually it's going to turn out to be central to their theories of politics. So we need to dig into that. And to explain what's driving them, I want to go to Locke's contemporary, who's actually somewhat older than Locke, the other famous English philosopher who we'll talk about more later in the course, Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a book called Leviathan, which is maybe the greatest work of political theory written in the English language. Certainly was the first great work of political theory written in the English language. During the English Civil War in the mid part of the century, which terrified Hobbes and in which he was determined to try and help end, But we're not going to talk about that part of Hobbes today. We'll get to that when we get to the social contract. Instead, we're going to talk about Hobbes's theory of science. And I'm going to give you this rather remarkable passage to think about, and it'll help us explain why they order those propositions as I said they did. The arts here in the second word of this paragraph refers to knowledge. That arts was a term that referred to knowledge. So they said, of the arts, some are demonstrable, others indemonstrable. And the demonstrable are those, the construction of the subject whereof is in the power of the artist himself, who, in his demonstration, does no more but deduce the consequences of his own operation. The reason whereof is this, that the science of every subject is derived from a precognition of the causes, generation, and construction of the same, and consequently, where the causes are known, there is place for demonstration, but not where the causes are to seek for. Geometry, we were just talking about geometry. Geometry, therefore, is demonstrable, for the lines and figures from which we reason are drawn and described by ourselves. Right? He doesn't say there's a theorem. He doesn't say there's a proof. He says it's because we make the triangles. And civil philosophy is demonstrable because we make the commonwealth ourselves. But because of natural bodies, we know not the construction, but seek them from the effects, there lies no demonstration of what the causes be we seek for, but only what they may be. So, Hobbes is saying here, what the triangle and the commonwealth have in common is that we make them, that they're the product of human wills. Therefore, we can understand what it is that we made. Whereas when you look at the natural world, well, God made the natural world. We have, we can come up, obviously the theory of the tidal influence, of the moon's influence on the tide is long after Hobbes's time. Maybe they would have had some other theory in the 17th century about the tides. But we can observe more or less rigorously, but we can never get the kind of certainty that we can get with the things that we ourselves make. So it's not that it's a deductive proposition or that it's an analytic proposition that puts the triangle up at the top or the geometrical question up at the top. It's because it's a product of human creation, and because civil society, civil institutions are also created by human beings. We can know them as well. Now, just I did this partly because that's such a dramatic statement of this view, but also I didn't want you to think that Locke's view, which is on this particular point identical to Hobbes's, maybe the only thing they really agreed on, because I didn't want you to think Locke's view was idiosyncratic. This was a very standard view. So Locke divides objective knowledge up in the following ways. He says the natural world, which he calls ectype ideas, the world of ectype ideas, he says God knows the real essence being how it really is, but human beings can only know what Locke called the nominal essence. It's Locke's analog as with Hobbes saying, we can only guess. We can't really know for sure because we didn't make it. Whereas when you turn to the social world, God knows the real essence because he knows everything. He's omniscient, as we said. But humans know the real essence as well. So human beings can have a kind of maker's knowledge of the political and social world that they cannot have of the physical world. And so that is why Locke, as I said, on this particular question agrees all the way to the bottom with Hobbes' statement that civil philosophy is demonstrable because we make the commonwealth ourselves. But because of natural bodies, we know not the construction, but seek it from its effect. All we can do is guess, right? So this is a very important thing to understand because it shaped their whole world view. And as they started to shed that view in the 18th century and the 19th century, the way in which they shed it had knock-on effects for what they had to say about politics. So it's very important that we get our minds around this.